He had owned this field for 32 years. He had never delayed the harvest. Not for weather. Not for equipment failures. Not for anything. But on the morning the crane appeared, he stood at the edge of the field with the tractor running and didn't get on. The crane was standing in the center of the rice, the part that was most ready, the section he had planned to cut first. It wasn't feeding. It wasn't moving. It was simply standing there, perfectly still, in the middle of his livelihood. His son called from the tractor, "Should I start?" The farmer looked at the crane for a long moment. Then he said, "Not yet." He didn't know why. 32 years of farming told him to start. Something older than 32 years told him to wait. 3 days later, he understood. Takashi Inoue was 61 years old and had been farming the same valley in northern Japan since his father handed it to him in the year he turned 29. The valley was a bowl of rice fields between two forested ridges, 12 farms in total, all of them working the same paddy system that the valley had been built around for 200 years, the water flowing down from the mountain catchment and through each field in turn before it drained to the river at the valley's southern end. Takashi's holding was 4.5 hectares, a modest size by modern standards, larger than most in the valley. He farmed it the way his father had farmed it and his father before that. Methodically, carefully, with an attention to the specific character of each section of the field that came from 32 years of watching the same ground through the same seasons. He knew which corner drained slowly. He knew where the soil was slightly acidic and required adjustment. He knew which section produced the heaviest grain heads and which consistently underperformed and why. He knew the field. He was certain of this, which was why the cranes surprised him. Red-crowned cranes, tancho in Japanese, were not common in this valley. They nested in the wetland areas further north, in the protected marshes where the conservation programs had spent decades rebuilding the population. They moved through the valley occasionally in the migration season, stopping in the wet fields to feed. Takashi had seen them perhaps a dozen times in 32 years, always briefly, always at the field edges, always moving on within an hour. This one had been here since dawn. He had arrived at the field at 5:45, before the light was fully up, in the pre-harvest routine of checking the water levels and the grain moisture content that would tell him whether the day's conditions were right for cutting. The crane had been there when he arrived, already in the field, already standing, already still. A large adult, pure white except for the black flight feathers and the distinctive red crown that gave the species its name. It was standing in the midfield section, surrounded by golden rice stalks that reached its lower body. He had stood at the field edge and watched it for a while before going to check his equipment. By 7, when his son Kenji arrived with the harvesting tractor, the crane had not moved. "There's a tancho in the field," Takashi said. Kenji looked. "In the section we're starting with." "Yes. Should we scare it off?" Takashi was quiet for a moment. The crane was clearly visible, the white of it bright against the gold of the rice, the stillness of it incongruous in a field that was supposed to be, today, full of the noise and movement of harvest. He thought about his schedule. He thought about the weather forecast, which was good for the next 3 days. He thought about the crane, which had been here since before he arrived and was showing no sign of leaving. "No," he said. "Give it time." They spent the morning on maintenance work, sharpening blades, checking the baler, doing the tasks that sat at the bottom of the priority list during the growing season and got done at the edges of harvest days. Takashi checked the crane twice more during the morning. It had moved slightly. It was now a few meters further into the midfield section, closer to the area where the field's water supply entered from the irrigation channel. Still standing, still not feeding. At noon, watching it through binoculars from the field edge, he noticed something he hadn't seen from a distance. The crane was not alone. In the rice stalks 2 meters behind the adult bird, almost completely hidden, visible only because he was looking through binoculars at exactly the right angle, was a nest. a low platform of pressed-down rice stems and collected material, sitting at the level of the water surface. And on the nest, just barely visible, the curve of an egg. He lowered the binoculars. He stood for a long time. A red-crowned crane had built a nest in his field, in the rice that was ready to harvest. He did not harvest that section for 17 days. He made the decision quickly, the way decisions made from instinct rather than calculation tend to be made, without a great deal of internal debate, simply as the action that the situation required. He called Kenji and told him they would start at the southern end of the field, furthest from the nest. They would harvest around the midsection, leaving a buffer of unharvested rice around the nesting area, and they would not approach it. Kenji didn't argue. He had grown up with the same landscape, the same sense that the valley had a particular character and that character included obligations. The harvesting proceeded around the island of standing rice. The midsection stood untouched, an irregular oval of golden stalks in a field that was otherwise cut to stubble by the third day. From the ridge above, where Takashi went on the fourth morning to look at the full shape of his field, it looked like something had simply been missed. A patch in the middle, inexplicably standing, the crane visible as a white shape at its center. A neighbor stopped by on the fourth day. An older farmer named Yoshida, who had been working the field adjacent to Takashi's for longer than either of them wanted to count. He looked at the island of uncut rice and then looked at Takashi. "Tancho?" he said. "Tancho," Takashi said. Yoshida nodded once and went back to his truck. There was no further discussion about it. In the valley, this was understood. On the ninth day, the egg hatched. Takashi knew because the crane's behavior changed, the long, rigid stillness of incubation replaced by a different quality of stillness, lower, more sheltering, the body position of an animal covering something smaller than itself. He watched from the ridge with binoculars and did not go closer. On the 12th day, he saw the chick for the first time. A small, brownish, improbably long-legged thing visible briefly at the edge of the nest platform before the adult's wing covered it again. He noted the date in his farm journal as he noted everything. On the 17th day, the adult crane. He had come to think of her as the adult crane, singular, though he knew the male bird was likely in the area, stood at the nest edge with the chick visible beside her, and they walked together through the remaining standing rice toward the field's water inlet, and then to the edge of the field, and then across the drainage ditch and into the grass of the uncultivated margin beyond. Takashi watched them go. He waited 2 more hours. He was not sure why exactly. Some sense that the space needed settling after their departure before he moved into it. Then he walked to the nest site for the first time. The nest was a simple platform of rice stalks and marsh grass, slightly raised above the water level, tucked into a place where the rice was particularly dense. The single eggshell was there, split cleanly, the interior pale, the outside bearing the pale olive color that red-crowned crane eggs had. He picked up the eggshell. He held it for a moment. Then he set it back down in the nest and walked back to the tractor. He called Kenji. He said, "We can finish." The midsection harvest took 1 afternoon. The grain there was slightly past optimal, 17 days past optimal, technically. The moisture content was higher than he would have preferred, and the grain heads had started to shed some of the lower seeds. He estimated the yield loss in that section at about 12% against what it would have been on the original harvest day. He noted this in his farm journal too. He noted it without particular emotion. It was a fact about the season, like the rainfall in June or the timing of the first frost. The red-crowned crane population in Japan had fallen to approximately 30 birds in the 20th century before conservation efforts began to reverse the decline. By the time of Takashi's harvest, the national population was over 2,000, a recovery that had been achieved through a combination of winter feeding programs, habitat protection, and the informal but deeply rooted cultural relationship between the Tancho and the communities that shared its landscape. The crane appeared on the Japanese yen. It appeared in poetry and in painting going back centuries. It was associated with longevity and fidelity and the specific quality of grace that the Japanese aesthetic sensibility called miyabi, refinement, elegance, the beauty that comes from something exactly as it should be. Takashi was not a sentimental man. He was a farmer. He thought about yield and weather and equipment maintenance and the price of rice in the autumn markets. He thought about the 12% loss in the midsection with the same practical acceptance. He thought about the losses that weather produced, real, quantifiable, factored into the year's accounting. He also thought about the eggshell, about the morning he had walked to the nest and held it, about the specific weight of it, lighter than he had expected, lighter than the weight of the decision that had surrounded it. He filed a record of the nesting event with the Regional Wildlife Authority that managed the crane population survey. The form asked for the nest location, the dates of occupation, the number of eggs, the hatching outcome. He filled it in precisely. In the notes section at the bottom, where the form said additional observations he wrote, the nest was located in the center of the harvest section. The harvest was delayed 17 days to allow the chick to leave the nest. This did not require a decision. It was the only thing to do. The Wildlife Authority coordinator who processed his form called him a week later to thank him and to note that the nest was the first confirmed red-crowned crane nesting in the valley in recorded history. The survey records went back 60 years, and no nesting had been documented in the rice field zone of this particular river valley before. "Why do you think she chose your field?" the coordinator asked. Takashi thought about this. He thought about the particular section of the field where the nest had been, the section near the water inlet where the rice was always slightly taller than the rest because the soil was richest there, where the water ran clear and the depth was consistent. The section he harvested last, usually, because it was furthest from the field road and required the most turning of the machinery. The section where a large bird standing still would be hardest to see from the road. She knew where she'd have the most time, he said, where she'd be least disturbed. The coordinator said she thought that was probably right. She thanked him again and said she hoped the family would return next season. Takashi said he hoped so too. He was already planning the next year's planting. He was planning it with a slight adjustment. The buffer zone near the water inlet would be planted 2 weeks later than the rest of the field, so that if the crane came back, the rice in that section would be 2 weeks behind the rest. It would still be harvestable. It would just give a nesting bird a little more time before the machinery arrived. He noted the adjustment in his farm journal. He noted it between the equipment service dates and the seed order numbers, in the same handwriting with the same black pen. It was a farming decision. It was also something else. The valley had its obligations and he had his. He had always known this. The crane had simply reminded him of one he hadn't thought about before.